our 34th annual conference. And like Brenda, I'm glad that we're able to turn around and respond during the pandemic and do this virtually. We would have missed having the conference during a long winter when we're home alone. The conference this year is a Geopolitics of the Arctic, a region in peril. Tickets for this live stream event will go on sale on November 30th through our website, and it will be live streamed to your home. You also can find a tremendous list of the presenters who will be part of this conference on www.camdenconference.org, beginning with our keynote speaker, Olafur Grimsson, the former president of Iceland. David Brancaccio will be coming back also to be our moderator, and we're very excited about that. Also on the websites are other interesting events and talks leading up to the February conference. One of these events I promised Matt Storr and I would mention is another event at the Belfast Library. Dick Topping will speak about Russia's interest in the Arctic on December 8th. So I hope you all register for that as well. Now I'm really pleased to present our speaker. Matt Ward was a diplomat from 1967 until 1996. He served in Vietnam, Cambodia, Haiti, Iran, Thailand, and China. And he pioneered the refugee processing system for boat people arriving on the shores of Indonesia and Singapore as well. Under his leadership in Taiwan, scores of US diplomats were trained in Chinese language, culture, economics, history, and politics. Matt served as director for European economies in transition for both Bush and Clinton. This office oversaw trade, developmental, and humanitarian policies for nation states that were manifested after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1988 to 91. I mean, these include 15 states that all of a sudden emerged, and we had to develop diplomatic relationships and trade agreements with. Finally, Matt has served on numerous councils, boards, committees, and associations. And now I'd like to turn it over and turn my computer around and give Matt the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy. That was a very flattering, if not entirely truthful introduction, but I'll take it. I'm not quite that accomplished. But nevertheless, it's a pleasure to be here. I will warn everybody to begin with, this is my first time using Zoom. So if there's some sort of a glitch, I may be responsible, but I probably am not going to be able to respond. In any event, we're meeting here tonight to talk about one of the most interesting countries in the world and their interest in one of the most interesting areas in the world. Oops. All right. Why is this not? Hold on. Okay. This is a map. We're going to start with a little bit just about China itself and China's approach to the world, including the Arctic. This is a map of the world the way you would see a world map taught in any Chinese school in Singapore, mainland China, Hong Kong, or Taiwan. Please notice that right in the very middle is China. China is the central kingdom, the central country, and the center of the world, as every Chinese knows. Now, you will notice it is not an Arctic country. It does not border the Arctic. And so it raises the issue of why is China interested in the Arctic? And that as well has to do with China's view of itself and its history. China sees the world through its own history, and it is a long history. as a famous Chinese philosopher who taught at Harvard in the 1920s said, he was proud to be from a backward-looking country. China looks, in Chinese, when you talk about the past, you literally say in front of my face. And when you talk about the future, you say behind my head. Because as everybody knows, you can see the past, you know it. You can't see the future. Now, and combining its a fascination with its own history, which is interesting in its own self. One of the other characteristics of the Chinese think about their country or see it is a country or a society that for millennia has produced wonderful things and sold them to the rest of the world. The Chinese, the famous Silk Route, which was not named the Silk Route until the 19th century by Europeans, was actually a planned trade outreach in the Han Dynasty to be able to reach people to the west of China. The Chinese not really sure who was there. And Chinese diplomats and explorers went as far as Afghanistan and went back and said, there are people out there and they'll buy our stuff. They're still thinking that way. China's interest in anything outside of China is conditioned by China's concept of where it fits in the global community. And the two biggest factors in public policy making for the Chinese is how they deal with the global community and does their policies mean prosperity and happiness for the people back home in China. China in the modern Chinese history begins in 1842. Very few countries can pick a date. But modern participation in the world community really dates to the nationalist revolution, Sun Yat-sen's revolution, when the empire was abolished and China became a republic dealing with the rest of the world. China is a founding member of the League of Nations and a founding member of the United Nations. I'm going to just, oops, maybe I have to go back here for a second. China is the only non-European permanent member of the UN Security Council. So China believes it has a seat at the table for all global issues. And China is very reluctant, because of its own history, to be what we would consider an ally with anybody. It believes that world problems should be solved by the world community, and everyone should have a voice, and everyone's voice ought to be respected. Nobody is really in charge. And secondly, they believe their own policies should be policies that promote harmony, happiness, wealth, and prosperity at home. That's what the Chinese believe government is supposed to do. In the 20th century, China has not been very successful in achieving that, in part because of the result of a civil war at home, the Japanese invasion in the late 1930s, and then for the mainland, the eventual installation of a communist government that had a less than rational approach to economic issues. But at the end of the Maoist period in the 1980s, China reverted to what it now calls socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is essentially a government determined to make China a modern economic power, to make the Chinese people rich, and to make it the greatest place on earth to live. It's almost as if the French spoke Chinese. Because that part is the French idea of what you do as well. Important to that is trade. The engine for making China rich is making stuff that other people want to buy and selling it to them. And China has been doing that for about 3,000 years. It has caused them unhappy experiences with some other countries. In fact, led to the Opium Wars in the 19th century, when a trade deficit with Great Britain was so severe that the British found only one way to remedy that, and that was to raise opium in India, sell it, smuggle it into China, cause massive addiction, and then try to balance their trade relations that way. And when the Chinese objected to that sort of behavior, the British Navy sort of put them in their place. And that situation really didn't remedy itself until after the Second World War. China is always interested in trade routes. It's always interested in safe, secure trade routes. If you remember your history, in the late 1400s, an Italian navigator convinced the Queen of Spain that he could find trade routes to the Orient and its massive treasures if he sailed west. He did, and he didn't find China, he found America. The Portuguese sailed around Africa to get back to China, and they did this for a very simple reason. For centuries, there had been trade that brought products from all over the Far East through China, across Central Asia, in what are called the Silk Routes. But in the mid 1400s, the Ottoman Empire, realizing what wealth was being traded through their territory, decided to impose taxes or tariffs on goods coming from China and essentially closed down the trade. The tariffs were so overwhelming that people just couldn't pay them. That sort of Venice business entrepot, and it made other European countries look for new routes. So the Chinese have known for at least 600 years that trading through the Middle East can be difficult. That, believe it or not, there are wars and upheavals that make organized trade difficult. So modern China has looked for trading partners that don't have political upheavals and political problems in getting their goods to market. The classic best route is the Pacific route. You can ship things from China to the western part of the United States. There's a great market there. People will buy stuff. They have money. Americans are rich. Everybody knows that. And that's an ideal trade route. It's secure. The Pacific is protected by the US Navy. Now, that works until people in the United States end up acting like the British did in the 19th century and saying, we're buying too much of your stuff and you're not buying enough of ours. And so maybe we're not going to buy as much. Then you have to find someplace else to sell stuff. And the next logical society to sell things to is Europe. But then you have the problem of crossing land that may not be very stable and getting your stuff to Europe. So one solution is shipping it through the Arctic. Now, shipping through ice is hard, but in recent years, there is melting in the Arctic, and for the first time in many, many, many years, lots of countries are talking about shipping routes through the Arctic. Shipping from Shanghai to Rotterdam, when there is a lane in the Arctic, by sea, cuts 12 days off the time for getting goods by land or getting goods by sea through the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean. Thus, China has a real interest in figuring out how you can use those shipping routes. China has a long history, modern China has a long history in dealing with Arctic issues. In 1920, you will learn this when you have someone who's an Arctic expert talking about it. There was a landmark treaty that decided who had sovereignty over the Svalbard Peninsula in the Arctic, which up until then was sort of a Wild West. Anybody can come, you can buy, sell, do anything you want. Norway got control over it. This is one of the first efforts by the League of Nations to bring stability to the Arctic. And in 1925, China signed the Spitsbergen Treaty, which made, in which China recognized Norwegian sovereignty over that area, but also gave China trading rights in the far northern parts of Norway. Not that China in 1925 was able to do anything. In 1925, the newly established Republic of China was in chaos. The Chinese experiment with American-style democracy had failed miserably. Warlords were running the country. One newly elected first president of China decided he was going to make himself an emperor. In the event that that sounds familiar, the Chinese have done it before. Other people have. But nevertheless, China felt it had an obligation to make a statement. Beginning with the new Deng Xiaoping reforms and the rebuilding of modern China in the 1980s, China established a polar research institute in Shanghai. It is now a leading scientific research institute, and it deals with research. 3 of its offices are conducting research in the Antarctic, 1 in the Arctic. Chinese scientific vessels have traveled to the Arctic. They have established research stations, and the Chinese icebreaker scientific lab, the Shuilong, the Snow Dragon, sailed through the Northern Sea Passage in 1999. China has established a research station in the Arctic, and China has beefed up considerably. Its largest embassy in the Scandinavian areas in Northern Europe is in Iceland. China sees Iceland as a point, an entrepot, a sort of northern Hong Kong where goods could be exchanged and research can be done. China is interested not just in selling Chinese goods to Europeans, but buying European goods. And the most prized of these are rare earth materials in Greenland, liquefied natural gas from the Norwegian shelf, and the Chinese see Scandinavians as peaceful, cooperative people who understand trade, who understand travel, and who aren't frightened by socialism. So, and there's been a lot of progress in bilateral development of bilateral relationships. Of course, shipping through what's called the North Sea route is only possible in the summer, and that limits what you can do. China in 2013 became a permanent observer on the Arctic Council, something that the United States poo-pooed at the time, pointing out, if we go back to that map, that China is not an Arctic country. But China was welcomed by Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, and Denmark. Denmark, of course, is the sovereign entity that controls Greenland. Concerned by Americans that we are an Arctic power with Alaska in the Arctic, but the Trump administration, one of its major concerns, is the expansion of what they consider Chinese power in the places where you wouldn't expect Chinese to be, and maybe they shouldn't be, according to the Americans. Objected to the membership of China in the Arctic Council, but the United States was largely outvoted by Canada and Norway and even the Russians. In 2018, the president of China, Xi Jinping, actually formally referred to the Polar Silk Road as part of China's Belt and Roads Initiative. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, that is the establishment of permanent trade routes, both by sea and by land, that connect China to the outside world, and designed for the Chinese to ensure that their ability to communicate and trade with other countries is not limited to one or two small ports on the South China Sea or the China Sea. This is a strategic concern of the Chinese since the Opium Wars, when the British were able to take control of Shanghai and Hong Kong and essentially defeat the Chinese in their actually hot war over trade issues. So having routes that allow Chinese goods to get elsewhere is really important. Let me see. Why am I? Oh, okay, there, we're back to, this is a map of essentially what is the Belt and Road. And China is investing large amounts of money in helping sites along the trade routes develop ports or railroads or highways. It's also essential to understand that Chinese policymakers believe that a world that is connected and interdependent by trade is less likely to be a world that goes to war. And the Chinese believe that in another world war, they suffered very badly in the last one, that another world war, any large population societies, India, China, will suffer more than small population societies. Whether that's true or not, that's a dogma sort of for Chinese policymakers. Okay. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages? So the easy advantages of Chinese involvement in the Arctic is the rest of the world will benefit by really professional scientific research. The Chinese have already done lots of research about the depth of the oceans, how you navigate them, where there are problems, just with physical navigation and information about the Arctic. It's almost entirely from a commercial trade point of view, but it's still useful to them. And the kind of trade connections with places like Greenland and Iceland promise to bring prosperity to those sites as well. The cons are almost overwhelming. First of all, to sail through the Arctic, the Chinese have to deal with the Russians. China has always seen Russia as a traditional adversary, I won't say enemy, but the Chinese have always found dealing with the Russians very difficult. And this goes back centuries. The Chinese believe that the Russians don't keep their word and are really interested in keeping China in a subordinate position. After the Opium Wars, China considered the two greatest adversaries it had in the world were Russia and Great Britain. And the problem of how you dealt with that, how you maintained your sovereignty when you had two great powers just looking for ways to gobble up your territory, was a real problem and remained a problem up through the Second World War. And then afterwards, when the communist side won the Chinese Civil War, they were shocked to find that their American allies in the Second World War didn't want to talk to them anymore because they were communists, and they were thrown into a camp with overbearing Russians, the Chinese would say, telling them how to be good communists. The Chinese have always had their own interpretation of what communism is. So you have that issue. Secondly, it's expensive. Research in the Arctic, trade in the Arctic, shipping through the Arctic is difficult. It costs a lot. You need special ships. And you don't have the security that the Chinese are really accustomed to in dealing with the United States. The Pacific is, in fact, a peaceful shipping route. And the US Navy has protected shipping routes throughout the Pacific. Now, the Chinese do have issues with the US Navy making sort of adventures, quasi-military adventures, too close to China, but they've always been happy to have a partner on the American side that A, keeps the Japanese in line, B, can deal with the Koreans, and keep the shipping lanes open, and people who have lots of money to buy their stuff. So switching trade routes, and particularly going through the Arctic, has a lot of cons and difficulties for the Chinese. The worst of which is they have to probably be nice to the Russians, which makes them swallow very hard. That essentially is China's interest in the Arctic. I would add that China very much believes that international trade routes should be international, not really controlled by any one country. There are exceptions to that. The Chinese recognize that the United States has special interests in the Caribbean. They recognize that a whole slew of countries have special interests and, in fact, territorial claims in the Mediterranean. They recognize that they have territorial claims in the South China Sea. And one of the reassuring factors in dealing with the Arctic is that most territorial issues in the Arctic have been solved. The Canadians, the Americans, the Icelanders, the Norwegians, the Russians have all sort of figured out what is their territorial waters and can be depended on to keeping trade routes open. Again, for the Chinese, the big question is the Russians, because what happens if the Russians decide suddenly they're going to declare territorial waters in places that they haven't been before? And lack of precedent and rules and clear ideas of who has what and who has always upset the Chinese. So, but they are clearly making headway in dealing with the Arctic nations. They now describe themselves, interestingly enough, as a near Arctic nation. They didn't get nearer geographically. So how do you do that? But, you know, the Chinese are inventive people as well, even in their politics. So I think that that's the end of my formal presentation. I'd be glad to take questions from anybody, or Brenda, I guess, is going to handle the questions.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. There actually are no questions in the chat at this moment, but maybe, and if you have a question right now for Matt, please unmute your mic and go ahead and ask. And at any point, Betsy or Matt, if you want to take off the screen share, then we'd be able to see people.
Okay, let me.
You just hit stop screen share. There you go.
Okay. Very good.
There.
There.
Oh,
Okay.
good.
So if anybody has a question, please feel free to unmute, and hopefully you won't all try to do it at the same time. So.
Oh, V.
Hi, Matt. How are you? I'm V. Sheehan in Portland.
Hi.
Thank you for such an interesting presentation. I was wondering how far you think the Chinese are in talking to the Russians about using the North Sea route. Is this all still entirely in the future, or do you think the Chinese are involved at the moment in some shipping?
Oh, the conversations have been going on for at least the last 2 years. Merchant ships belonging to Costco, that's not the American company, that's the Chinese Overseas Shipping Company, which is a big state-owned enterprise. I think at least a dozen ships have made the passage already. The single most popular item that is being shipped right now from China through the northern route is to Norway, and it's Chinese-made windmills for power generation. And they're very high quality. The Norwegians are very happy with them. You can get them from Shanghai to whatever probably the Svalbard area in northern Norway in the summer, I think I said 10 or 12 days, shorter than if you ship them through the Suez Canal to Rotterdam. That makes them cheaper. I think it's important here in parentheses on this to remember that contemporary China, under its current reforms, is really a big corporation run by Xi Jinping to make stuff and sell it and make people prosperous in China. So getting Chinese products to happy customers is a great goal. And so far, the Chinese have not encountered too much interference from the Russians. I mean, the Chinese plan this stuff out in great detail. I'm sure the Russians fall asleep at some of these negotiations, but exactly where the ships can land and what they can do and everything else, because they don't want problems. But no, it is ongoing, but it is still very much in a beginning phase. I should point out also there's a whole issue in shipping through the Arctic for the Scandinavians and to a certain extent for the Chinese about climate concern and pollution. And, you know, the fact is the Chinese are able to take advantage of this shipping route because ice is melting in the Arctic. And one of the biggest causes of pollution that's causing that melting is China. You know, so the Scandinavians are sort of saying, we'll be glad to deal with you, but you got to do something about your carbon emissions. You know, it's
from the ships themselves, or also from just in terms of China's participation in world efforts to limit carbons?
Well, the Chinese are taking this very seriously, in part because it does affect their trade relations. But, you know, when you have 1.5 billion people and they aren't doing anything like they did under Mao, you know, the old joke was if you worked in a Chinese factory under Mao, you went to the factory in the morning and pretended to work, and at the end of the week, the government pretended to pay you. Well, there's no carbon emissions, but when you get that number of people actually working and making stuff, there is. And so the Chinese are very, very interested in non-coal-based, to begin with, non-coal-based electric power. They want to clean up the atmosphere too. There's an ancient philosophic Chinese reason for that too. That has to do with Taoism and living in harmony with the earth. But nevertheless, for the time being, this manufacturing boom in China has made the country a major fossil fuel user and carbon emitter. So how do you balance that?
Matt, it seems like we have another question. Susanna Hancock has her hand raised. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. I listened to your presentation 2 years ago on China. So hearing this, it's good fun to listen to you again.
I see a Yale sweatshirt.
Yeah.
Are you an Eli?
Not personally, but I've done some things with them, including actually I was in China last year with.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's the outstanding. That's the dean of China Studies schools in the United States.
Yes.
You know.
So I was there with my university and met up with the Yale group and met up with their Chinese cohort. So it was good. My question is, I was just wondering if you can talk a little bit, and you did a moment ago in Fee's question about carbon, but the sort of foreign affairs implications of China's interests in the Arctic.
You mean strategic interests?
Yeah, sort of their strategic interests in the affairs. You're talking about how they need to have relations with Russia,
Right.
but obviously the U.S. wasn't as keen on having them as observer states for the Arctic Council. And if you can just speak a little bit about some of those implications.
I'm
Okay.
not talking,
Yeah.
I'm not listening.
Oops. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This is very interesting because I think at heart, the Chinese would prefer to be able to go anywhere they want to in the world and sell Chinese goods without interference. And that's sort of China's view of its strategic place in the world. And it doesn't, and the Chinese don't want to be interrupted in doing that. And I would say 35, 40 years ago, in the late 1980s, China thought they had an ally in the United States, not a strategic ally, but somebody who was glad to pay to keep the shipping routes protected, keep particularly Russia in its place. That was the whole Nixon-Kissinger reason for playing the China card, so to speak, was to keep the Russians in their place. The world changed after the Soviet Union fell apart. And moreover, attitudes have changed in the United States. As Barack Obama said, President Trump has gone to a more extreme version of this. The United States is tired of going around the world and seeing that there's order while other people benefit from it. And one of the big beneficiaries was China, right after that, Europe. Of course, I think what Barack Obama said is, we're tired of having you guys hold our coats while we do the heavy work. So there's more and more feeling in the United States that the United States should, and I'll give you some examples where the United States has pulled back, dealing with Somali pirates, for instance, in the Horn of Africa. Americans have sort of said European shipping, and by the way, big European shipping nations are like the Danes and the Dutch, who don't spend anything on protecting the seas, or very little. So in that situation, China is faced with, well, what do we have to do to protect shipping routes? And the Chinese don't really want to be in a position where they have to confront the Russians. Old Chinese military philosophy that goes back centuries says that once there's a hot war and people are actually fighting with one another, you've lost. So, and it's expensive. And the Chinese count their money, they don't want to have shit. But increasingly, there is pressure within the Chinese military, for people who think China is governed by sort of a group of people and they all agree on everything. They don't. The Chinese military is more and more saying, we're being threatened. Other people are going to push us around. We're going to end up, not being able to deal with the world unless we take a stronger military stance. So the current people in power in Beijing have been able to keep a balance in that. I think that is going to be harder and harder in the next decade. For one reason, you have younger Chinese who are the generation of the one-child family, where every single Chinese child grows up thinking that he or she is the greatest gem to mankind. The Chinese can do anything they want and nobody should stand in their way. And that is reckless, which is not a traditional Chinese characteristic. But I think there's more. You're beginning to see that in younger people in the foreign ministry. They're saying we don't have to listen to people say bad stuff about China, you know, et cetera. I think watch for a shift in China's approach to strategic issues. And certainly the Arctic, if it becomes a major shipping route, is going to be a flashpoint. And of course, that's the whole point of the Chinese who want to start the polar route, is to get away from flashpoints like the Suez Canal and the Persian Gulf, and all where, from the Chinese point of view, all these crazy people live and fight with one another all the time, you know. But yes, it's as we found, you know, a century and a half ago, you can't just become an industrial giant and a financial giant and an economic giant and hope, as we did, that the British Navy was going to see that the seas were secure so that we could make lots of money. And eventually we had to take a role. And I think as the rest of the world becomes more prosperous, we're going to expect, the American people are going to expect. I'm not sure the strategic thinkers in Washington are ready to do that, but I think the American people are just going to say, we're not going to pay for this anymore, you know. You already see that in the relationship with Europe. So, but I will add one other thing that I didn't say earlier. I grow weary of people saying China has the second largest economy in the world. Europe has the second largest economy, but we count their statistics by country rather than as an economic unit. And we count China as a unit because it's the equivalent of Europe. It's really this amalgamation of so many different ethnic groups and languages and things that just because they've been together for 3,000 years, we think it's going to stay that way, you know. So that's, anyway, it's a very good question. And I don't have a crystal ball, and like the Chinese, I can see backwards a lot better than I can see what's behind me. So, but it's a concern. It is a big concern.
Thank you very much.
I have a question.
Yes, John.
Yes. Do you anticipate any curtailment of Chinese imports coming to the United States and Western Europe as a result of having seen some of the vulnerabilities and dependencies as a result of COVID? Do you think there's a fundamental change in strategy coming because of it, or is this simply a blip on the screen?
Let me put it this way. I think the Chinese strategy, commercial strategy, which is central to their whole push to become a modern, prosperous society, is not going to change. The Chinese are going to sell, increasingly make higher quality goods and sell them at reasonable prices to anybody who will pay them in hard currency. I mean, that's crass sounding, but it is. I mean, that's, and the ideal currency right now, and this is becoming a serious question for the Chinese, is the US dollar is the currency. It's the reserve currency. It is the equivalent of what gold was, you know, in the 16th and 17th century, when Spain had all the gold and other people had to try to get it from them one way or another. The Chinese are very concerned about what they consider to be, and remember, these are people who call themselves communists, US mismanagement of the American economy and the increasing debt and things like that. So will they stop selling stuff? No, but the national saps if the United States defaulted on its debts, you know, and that's not good for anybody. So they are looking at other places, but these are, you know, how many wind turbines can you sell to the Saudis? You know, I mean, the US market is still the best. The Americans just buy stuff and then throw it away and buy more stuff. After that, the Europeans. And it is why the Chinese are so interested in helping to get African and Middle Eastern countries sort of off and start towards development themselves. So that I think you do have thinkers in China who are very concerned about Chinese dependence on not only the American market as a consumer, but I think most Americans don't understand how closely integrated the modern Chinese economy is with the American economy. I mean, components, things that are manufactured in China are made with components that come from the United States and vice versa. And because of NAFTA, or the new NAFTA, which I refuse to call the USMCA or whatever it is, because I believe, and today is November 10th, USMC belongs to the United States Marine Corps. Today's their birthday. Happy birthday, Marines. But that the movement back and forth across those borders of items that are one component from here, then it's shipped there, and 2 or 3 items are put together, and then it's shipped somewhere else. The integration of the Chinese manufacturing sector with North America is just incredible. So you can't separate it out that easily. And for the time being, it benefits both sides. Now, you know, there less prosperous times in America means there's going to be less purchasing. But, you know, and I think unlike us, the Chinese do not publicly talk about why they're disappointed with other countries. We just have a habit of doing that all the time, telling everybody else why they're not up to snuff. We can't help ourselves. We mean well. But yes, it's in 2008, you know, we were largely responsible for the world financial crisis. China was the engine that pulled the world out of it. I don't think that's going to happen this time after COVID. But the recovery of the Chinese economy and the quick recovery will be a big help. Jane is on the line here. Jane, nice.
I don't know why her name's there.
No.
Are there any more questions?
There's John is back.
Yeah, I have a question. It's Mark DeLay.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm enjoying this very much. And my question is, are special double-hulled vessels required to transit the Arctic, or can any conventional ship do so? And secondly, what is the risk of a major oil spill, say, in the Arctic because of the uncertain ice conditions?
You know, I'm disappointed. I have a Foreign Service colleague who passed away a couple of years ago, who was a graduate of the Maine Maritime Academy and could have really answered your question on double hull ships. But my general understanding is, yes, you need specialized ships to move through the Arctic, not only because of the ice flows, but because in many places the sea routes are shallow.
I see.
They are not as deep as you have on the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean, or so the answer is yes. And yes, is there a danger? There certainly is a danger. The Norwegians are very, very aware of this because they are an oil crude producing area and they ship from Norway, and storms can come up. You know, you have to be very careful. And China is not interested in doing something that makes them look like a bunch of incompetents. So yes, they do have, the Chinese have ships that you can use, but not a huge fleet. And I think what the Chinese are depending on is for Danish, Norwegian, Icelandic ships to bring stuff. The Chinese always are going to look for the cheapest way to get the best, get the most goods, you know, good measure for your money. That's, I don't think they don't have the fleet. Now, one entity, this is what we're talking about China, is that probably the Republic of China on Taiwan does have ships. And I know it's common here in the United States to think that those two entities just despise one another and never deal with one another. But Taiwan investors are the largest single foreign, you can't call them foreign because they're Chinese, investors in mainland China. And part of this whole integrated economy is how Taiwan goods are integrated into the mainland and then converted and shipped elsewhere. So, but I think, and certainly the Russians do, and so that puts the Chinese in the position of having to say, okay, well, we'll have Russian ships carrying goods into Chinese ports, which is going to make a lot of Chinese uncomfortable. But if it makes money, they'll figure out how to do it. Yeah. It's just the beginning right now.
So this group that includes the Scandinavian countries and Iceland, the US, Canada, and China, are they establishing laws, legislation that would control the kinds of vessels that are needed and et cetera?
The easy answer to that is yes. With the Arctic Council's been around for a long time, and it's I'm not sure you would call it a governmental. I used to think it was in the old days, it was a group of Vikings that got around and had drinks, and but they have over the years addressed almost all. This is one of the secure parts about shipping through the Arctic. The Scandinavian countries have pretty much solved almost all of the issues of territorial privilege and how you do it and what the rules are. And they're very climate sensitive, very concerned about how you do it. And the Swedes and the Norwegians and the Icelanders learned a long time ago how to deal with the Russians, I think, on some of this. So, and remember the Canadians are up there and they're nice to everybody. And they're usually pretty good at getting good, sound, scientific regulations. So that's an advantage. From my point of view, that's an advantage. You know, it does mean that, you know, just if you do business any place where there are stricter regulations, it's going to cost you a little bit more. But in the long run, it's safer. So I think the Chinese are more comfortable these days with places that have regulations where you know what you're supposed to do than sort of wild-eyed places where today, tomorrow it's the next rule. Oh, you didn't bribe the right guy. You know, that's too unnecessarily complicated for Chinese. And I mean, they're easier to deal with us. If you're very clear on what you want and how you want it, they sort of turn you out when 1 week it's one thing, the next thing it's the next week. There's some exaggerated complaint, and then there's this wonderful praise. They just, they don't get it.
Well, along those lines, what is the number of ships now passing through the Arctic versus what it's going to be 10 years from now? Is it just an occasional ship now, right?
Yeah, I would say right now it is, because we're just beginning to have a period where there's regular thawing in the summer. I mean, you can't really ship through the Arctic in the winter at all. It's like trying to get something done in northern Maine after Thanksgiving. You have to wait until May. I think that's, so this is a lot of different countries testing the water. And the US concerns about this is that I think sort of they were caught by surprise that the Chinese are so interested, and I think US military thinkers are very concerned about, I don't share their concern 100%, but about Chinese activities where the Chinese haven't been before. And if you will remember, I think it was earlier this year, and everyone laughed at our current president when he was offered to buy Greenland from Denmark. Well, he meant that sincerely, believe it or not, because he was concerned that the Chinese were going to put research stations and investments in Greenland, and that the Danes, of course, were too naive to do anything about this. So if we just bought Greenland, we could control it. That's the thinking behind that. So, but yes, this is beginning. This is the Chinese are testing the waters. That's not meant as a pun, but it's largely because this is the first time in decades, if not centuries, that regular navigation of the Arctic is possible.
Well,
Otherwise, I don't think the Chinese would be particularly interested.
Other people want to ask questions.
thank you.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much.
Matt, we have a question from Jane on the chat. She wants to know, can you fill out the trade picture beyond the windmills to Norway? What other countries and industries are the main recipients of trade with China through the Arctic route?
The ideal recipient, from the Chinese point of view, all of Europe. And then otherwise, anything that you would sell through the port of Rotterdam, that's a Chinese product, which is one of the largest ports in the world. Right now, to get Chinese goods to Rotterdam, and that means to Scandinavia, to Germany, and eventually even through the Mediterranean, you have to go through the Suez Canal and through the Mediterranean. And that's a long, expensive route. So any Chinese good, computers, iPhones, televisions, silk, which has been sold, tea, porcelain, just about the Chinese economy, when it works, is a juggernaut. It's, it's sort of like, well, what do you want us to make for you? Send me a drawing and we'll make it. We'll make 4,000 of them and we'll sell them to you. It's anything that the Europeans are buying. European markets are much more, by the way, sophisticated and demanding. They demand higher quality than what American markets do. So that's another issue for Chinese sales, but just about everything. But if you're just going to Norway and places like that, there are Chinese large mechanical equipment and stuff like that is, you know, the Norwegians can still buy Mercedes from Germany. They don't need to buy cars from China. So.
All right, well, thank you, Matt. Does anybody else have a question they want to unmute and ask? I think we have time for one more. Oh, it came in on chat. Hold on. Can you see that in the chat, or do you want me to read it?
Yeah, you read it.
So Eli says, it's not Arctic related. How do you see the tension playing out between Xi's nationalist rhetoric for domestic audience, re Taiwan, and other expansionist policies in China's periphery, and a desire for regional stability to facilitate international trade? All this vis-a-vis a potential twilight for the Pax Americana in the Pacific Rim.
Oh, boy.
That's a lot of questions.
That's a lot of questions, but let me try to address some of them. I think there is a natural national pride among Chinese. The Chinese are very sensitive to foreigners pushing them around. And they think of themselves as a very accomplished people. So any leader of China has to reassure the citizens that they are who they think they are. Just, you know, like our leaders regularly, I'll step back here and say, we always say China, the Chinese invented this, the Chinese invented that. One of the things we Americans are known for is what is called cultural exceptionalism. We are an exceptional people. Well, the Chinese invented that. And just as American leaders play to that in America, Chinese leaders have to. The current Chinese leadership, however, has to be very, very careful. And they know this because there is an ultra nationalistic sentiment in China that is simply, and it's mostly younger people, and it's what I call Han-centric, and it's sort of the Chinese equivalent to white supremacy. And any Chinese leadership that looks like it is, I hate to use this term, kowtowing to foreigners is in trouble. This idea that she's going to be there forever. She is not Mao. And his coalition of sort of modern managers that want to keep a largely central role is threatened by two groups. One very small that really wish they could go back to old-fashioned socialism, and the other ones who really want to show the rest of the world that China can do whatever they want. So it would be helpful in maintaining a stable China if outside powers, and I won't name any, stopped calling names and pushing the Chinese into a situation where they almost are going to have to go to war. And one of the issues is Taiwan. Taiwan is part of China. And the government on Taiwan is not the government of the Republic of Taiwan. It's the government of the Republic of China. They say that. And they say they are the government of the mainland as well. And the main, you know, and that hasn't been resolved. And it wasn't resolved in 1949 because the US Navy sailed into the Taiwan Straits and stopped the Chinese from following the nationalists to Taiwan. I don't think anybody in Beijing now really regrets that because there is something that's stabilized. But in the State Department, that issue of how you dealt with Taiwan, and I lived in Taiwan as an American diplomat, but as, quote, private citizen, as part of the American Institute in Taiwan, we called that strategic ambiguity. We don't tell the Chinese how to deal with Taiwan. We don't tell the Chinese on Taiwan how to deal with the mainland, except in private, we are very strict when we say if one bullet arrives on either side, you guys are toast. But we don't take sides. And I think it is very dangerous in the last couple of years that we have a government in Washington that is pushing that subject. And there is absolutely no reason. The Chinese on Taiwan are smart. The Chinese on the mainland are smart. They have figured out little by little how to deal with one another. They can solve the problem. But you raise that's a real issue. And it becomes more serious if we start to withdraw from the Pacific. You know, if we just go in there and stir stuff up and then say, okay, you guys solve it. Nobody, the Japanese don't want to see that. The Koreans don't want to see it. The Vietnamese don't want to see it, you know. Didn't we learn anything from our experience in Vietnam about, you know? So it's a very serious issue. It really requires sort of common sense and calmness and encouragement of the people in Taiwan and the people on the mainland to let's all get along. And over time, you know, many years ago, my first tour in an Asian country, which will remain nameless, a wonderful old gentleman said to me, when I was asking him about his impression of Americans, he said, you're very friendly, but you hug people too tightly. And you have this idea of, oh, look, there's a problem. Don't just stand there, do something. Where Asians would say, just stand there. You don't have to do anything right now. These problems don't have to be solved next Wednesday at 9 p.m. You know, the Chinese have been dealing with issues like this for a couple thousand years. And what's another 100, you know? In fact, I'll even add, I once said this to a Chinese audience, that when you're dealing with the Chinese on so many issues, you get this feeling that they say, okay, you do things your way, we'll do things our way. We'll get together and compare notes and see who is better sometime down the road. And you say, oh, next year. No, not next year is too soon. 10 years? No. 20 years? No. 100 years? Well, we were thinking 1,000 years. You know? So anyway, it's an excellent question. If I had hours, we could go over the details, but it is very serious, and how the US conducts itself in the Pacific is going to determine whether there's world peace in the next century. So.
Well, I don't see any more questions. I see clapping for you.
Oh, that's very kind. That's very kind.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Matt, and everybody for joining us. And I look forward to seeing you again next time on December 8th on the Belfast Library Zoom window. We'll be having Dick Topping. So until then, everyone take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Be safe. Bye, Matt. Bye, Betsy.
Thank you.